I find that preaching alone in my office, my emotions are a little more plain, at least to myself, and I'm just a little sad today. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But maybe Paul has something to say that at least gives us something to reach for, something that gives us hope for a next, because Christ is at the center of the creative power of the universe. So would you listen as I read the end of the second chapter of Ephesians? We've read the larger context in past weeks. But I'm going to begin in verse 17. Speaking of Christ, so he came and proclaimed peace to you who were far off, and peace to those who were near. For through him both of us have access to one Spirit, to the Holy Parent. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are citizens with saints and also members of the household of God, built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the cornerstone. In him the whole structure is joined together and grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you are also built together spiritually into a dwelling place for God. As my sister-in-law likes to say, the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. The Hebrew mystics tell us that when Solomon's temple was destroyed, love was exiled. Love was exiled. I mean, it's a mythic image, but I think it's real. There's a sense that that place where God was present and dwelled among the people, when it was destroyed, it's like the connection between the people and God, that dwelling place within, had disappeared. Love in exile. My friend Mark Goffney says that it was exiled into the sexual, and the sexual isn't something that can hold the entire creative love power of God, and why it becomes so distorted. And he might be right. I don't know, but I have a growing sense of what it is like when love is exiled from human society, because we haven't built it in particularly well. We haven't built it into our psychology, our sociology, our politics, our economy. I mean, the creative power of God, that love that carries us forward, that evolutionary impulse. I mean, it's often exiled from the human life, from human community. It feels that way to me anyway. On Christmas Day, an article came out in the New York Times about my friend Mark Goffney, and there was nothing new about it. It talked about him as a rising spiritual teacher and leader, but it also brought up past allegations and accusations, some of which he knows about, that have been around for as much as 35 years. And there are some people within our larger community, what might be called the integral world. I sometimes euphemistically call it that. Some people in the community feel that the behavior that Mark has exhibited over the years disqualifies him completely from being a teacher, and they would like to see him stripped of any sense of authority, and see the teaching and the work around him collapse, because they just don't believe he's worthy of the position. And other people have the sense that the charges, particularly as he became a full-fledged adult, as those charges are inflated, and not just inflated, they become projections in a very complicated set of relationships. Because he's a powerful man, and certainly an imperfect man, and so it invites some of those projections, it seems, to some of us. But what really concerns me here is not trying to figure out which one of those groups or thoughts about Mark is right and which one is wrong. I've done that in other places. Now, what concerns me here is the exile of love from a community that is generally focused on the power of God's love, that evolutionary impulse to drive creation forward into a more whole and full and love-centered tomorrow. It concerns me that love has been exiled. And what concerns me is this creative process that it requires wisdom, it requires thoughtfulness, self-inspection, and it requires some judgment about who we are and where we fall short. I mean, anytime love is at work in a human being, there needs to be a recognition that human beings do in fact fall short, every single one of us, on all sides of all things. And as we fall short, we're called upon to look and see where we are separated from the presence of the divine, where we are distorted, the image of God that is looking to emerge from us is distorted and off base. And you do that. You make that sort of confession, I guess is what the church would call it, in the context of recognizing that the presence of love, that the dwelling of God within you, is carrying you past that to a new life, that part of you needs to die. It needs to be recognized, and it needs to be put aside so that new life can emerge and occur. And those things have to happen in that context of the recognition of love. And when love is exiled, when there's only judgment present, then the healthy boundaries and the process of restoration and redemption and growth and development that we all look for, well, those things don't operate. And it concerns me. When judgment loses the perspective of new life, when it's like judgment anger feeds on itself and loses the perspective of the goal of new redeemed life, well, that's the moment that we have lost track of the purpose of community. Love's been exiled. Now, I'm not going to talk about whether Mark does that or the other side does that. Instead, I'll talk about me. I left the First Presbyterian Church of San Rafael about a year ago, and in fact, it was Mark that began to kind of poke at me and show me that I was leaving with a lot of anger. I was really frustrated with the congregation after 8 years. I probably should have left 3 years before that. But I became frustrated. Doesn't even matter why. It was because I felt that they should be doing some things that they weren't doing. But what I began to discover is that the anger and the frustration that lived in me was really attached to a pretty distorted view of myself and my ego. And it wasn't about the expression of God's love within me. It was about something else entirely. In fact, that anger was casting a shadow over the light that was seeking to get out of me. The anger was casting a shadow over the love that I realized I was withholding from that group of people towards the end of my tenure in that congregation. Something I had to recognize about myself. It's something that I still have to recognize. I have to work through that because I think it's so important to develop church communities that can think against violence, that won't exile love. I mean, all those things are important to me, but to miss the point of seeking new life in the other instead of judging them, well, that was the shadow that was operating in me. And I think we all need to be aware of that. When we see the self-righteous anger thrive within us, we we need to check in on our motivations, on where the true light of our love might be. There's an awful lot of lost perspective in our world these days. This judgmental anger in our politics everywhere on all sides. In universities all over the country, it's stunning from my point of view to see the narrowness of many groups that I might otherwise normally agree with, where they stand opposed to the other in a self-righteous stance. Oftentimes with very good points, don't get me wrong. It's not just because you realize that there's something going on with you doesn't mean that everybody else is right. But I think we would all do well to reach for that image of the temple where God dwells, where the love, that is the power to move through death to a new life in all ways, where that love is dwelling within us and within our communities. We do well to reach for that. But the reality is to seek that temple, to seek that place where love is not exiled. Well, those kinds of relationships, and that kind of wisdom and judgment, that gets pretty messy. It's pretty difficult to sort all that out because human relationships aren't all that easy. They're complex. And it takes enormous courage on all sides to recognize what's going on internally and then to make some judgments and seek some new life in the other. It takes courage. Paul talks about the law getting in the way. I think that's Paul's way to talking in that circumstance about judgment and how judgment can wrap us up really tight. And it's when we lose sight, we stay with the judgment and lose sight of the new life, that we lose the possibility of the dwelling place of God living within us. It's easier, you understand, to stick with the judgment because then we don't have to look at the self. It just doesn't lead us anywhere. And I believe that God is calling us forth into a new hope, into a place where human society doesn't automatically assume that the other is off base and seek to destroy it. It's that I think the gospel is calling us to, because when we sit in the presence of God's love, we can take heart and courage by examining the self, and within that context, seek God's wisdom for understanding the other. I was looking for a line here. Not a defensive line, but a line that called forth what's possible among friends and among people who disagree. I guess I'll have to depend on the grace of God to see where it goes from here. Thank you.